here with this group, and thank you so much for deciding to spend a little bit of your Thursday afternoon, evening with us. What an amazing turnout. So, in my world, communications is really the foundation of everything. It's how we build brands, it's how we create trust, and it's ultimately how we all lead. And what I love about this panel is that we're looking at leadership comms from very different lenses, from global impact, like Desiree was saying, to AI, to innovation, to business, and to operations. So, with that, I'm really excited to dive in. So I thought, let's start with something foundational. Leadership voice is something that people talk about a lot, but it's not always clear on how you actually develop it. Pamela, I'd love to start with you and ask, how did you discover or develop your authentic leadership voice over the course of your amazing career?
Oh, thank you so much. I think I run Universal Giving. We help people donate and volunteer all over the world. And so you're dealing with helping major donors who could be millionaires and billionaires versus nonprofits who are living off of $200 a year. So I think what's really important is to make sure that you are taking each experience that you go through, whether it's a volunteer trip on the ground or meeting with a major millionaire, and really kind of add your experience, figure out who you are, keep realizing that every day you're growing. And what I recommend is start telling your story to yourself. So when I go on walks and we all have to present who we are, I practice presenting who I am. And as more experiences happen in my life, I keep working on that narrative. I never stay the same. My team knows that my written bio, we're constantly updating it. You're constantly practicing it as well, because when you practice it, you want to get so good at it that you don't think about it. So I think when you're developing that leadership voice, it's not just in the meeting in the moment. You're thinking about who you are, what you're learning, and practice it. When you go on a walk, you can walk your dog, you can kind of, practice announcing who you are and get so comfortable with it that it's just so easy for you. You don't want to be nervous when you're talking about your narrative or your leadership voice.
Completely. And one more question to go off that. Was there a defining moment you would say that really shaped how you communicate as a leader today?
Well, there were several. I don't think there could be one. But I think one thing I really knew about myself is you should choose at least 1 to 2 areas that you know you've got to change. When I first started out, I could speak really quickly. I could speak so quickly, but people couldn't keep up with me. And so when I first started to speak slower, it felt very unnatural. But now it feels natural because I know I'm helping the person who's the listener. They certainly can't talk, they can't handle someone talking that quickly. I might think that quickly, but in order to be a good leader and have a good leadership voice, you need to think about your audience and what they can handle. I know I speak and think too quickly, so I need to slow down. That's been a joy because now it's in my DNA and people receive the message so much more. You feel so much more comfortable with it. My best friends, I can speak as quickly as I want, not when you're talking about a leadership voice.
Completely. Ruth, kicking it to you quickly. You're operating in environments where things are constantly evolving, especially with AI and innovation. How do you think about developing a leadership voice when the landscape itself is changing so quickly day to day?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great question, and especially to frame it in terms of what's happening today. So, first of all, I found that it's not just about personality or cadence, but it's around your lived experience. And I learned that, or being early to this innovation movement, that there was also a lot of faux innovation around. There were people kind of borrowing language from each other and saying things that they hadn't lived or touched. And so that became a big part of my authentic leadership voice was grounded communication. And so when people know they're speaking to me, they know that I'm willing to call things out and maybe say something that is a little, jolting. So for example, the first time I was asked to come speak about innovation back in the early 2010s, I didn't borrow language. I leaned on my lived experience, and I knew from having had roles in operations and in startups what needed to happen and how to connect innovation to the front lines. And so I leaned on that. I also said something pretty unpopular. I said, not everyone's cut out to work on the future. That was something that I learned being in the innovation space, people think that innovation is just having an opinion, but it's also about putting the patterns together, connecting the dots, being willing to get in the trenches, and being willing to get hands-on with new technology and think through how does this fit into an infrastructure. And so I started to speak about not everyone's cut out to work on the future, and that drew people in. That's just one example of how grounded communication works. And the same thing with AI. I talk a lot about how there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of tools, but the gap is there when it comes to architecture and how do you think through the different pieces and components. It's not just about the hype and it's not just about the tools. So that's a little bit about my grounded communication style.
I love that grounded communication. I'm gonna save that arsenal. Sean, I think I saw you pop on. I know you've been having some technical
Yes,
difficulties.
no, thank you. Yeah, sorry about that, and appreciate you guys having me on. And thank you, Desiree, and thank you, Katie. And yeah, great to be with everyone. And appreciate you guys having me.
Amazing. Well, while I have you and your internet appears to be working, I want to ask
Yes, I'm
you
sorry about that.
from a business and ops perspective, how has your leadership voice evolved as you've grown teams and expanded into new markets?
Yeah, I think it's been honestly going back to my days at USC and Annenberg and everything, and learning from all the great professors and teachers. That was always a really good start for me, and having that background and everything. And I think just over time and over the years of my career, meeting new people and finding, the different things that change and evolve throughout the world with tariffs and, global economy just constantly changing, like you said. So it's constantly just a ever changing process. So I think just having that experience and dating back to my roots at Annenberg and the great lessons I learned there, I always kind of go back to that and trying to find the good voice that I've kind of learned then, and just have that evolve over time with the ever changing world that we're kind of living in.
Thank you so much. And before we move on, I can share a little bit quickly about my own experiences as well. I think building a company in the social media space today, your voice really gets shaped in real time. Social media is ever evolving day to day, minute to minute. And early on, I thought leadership meant having all the answers, but what I've learned is that it's much more about clarity as well as consistency. Your team doesn't need to be perfect. They just need to understand how you think and where you stand on certain topics. And honestly, I think your voice becomes the strongest when it's tested, whether that's with your clients or with team challenges or even in growth moments. So with that, let's shift into high stakes communication because I think that's where communication really does get tested. Pamela, you have worked in global and crisis-driven environments and would love if you could share a few examples of high pressure comms moments and what you've learned from those experiences.
Yes, I think when you're dealing across different cultures and sometimes different time zones, people have flown in, they're exhausted, all of that. One of the hardest things for us to do is to have silence. I always say silence is your friend. Before you start speaking, read the room, and I literally mean look at everyone before you start speaking. You're going to connect with them. It's not just about verbal, we know that, and it's really about just when someone asks you a question or asks you to participate, just look around at everyone first and just make sure that they kind of feel included and connected in that. It's okay as well to say things, for example, like, I'd like to think about that. Can we come back to that later? You want to make sure that you're deflecting the situation again and again because that crisis situation can happen. Often, if one person as well in the room gets very agitated, what you can do is say, you have a very important voice. Make sure they're validated and say, I'm wondering if you'd like to take a pause right now while you think about some of these important issues to you, and that we listen to someone else, and then we're going to come back to you. So they feel they can still have their voice. The crisis moments, people take over the conversation, they can get very volatile. My biggest advice is, how can you slow it down?
Wonderful. And Ruth, when you're in moments where alignment or trust or reputation is on the line, how do you prepare for those types of conversations?
Yeah, so I think early on, especially in an innovation role, I thought my job was to convince and persuade, but I learned that it's not. It's really to have conviction and to show up with conviction about the information because in those high pressure moments, my role is to create clarity and give the leaders in the room the best possible chance to understanding these shifts and where we go next. So once I reframed from, convincing to clarity, that was very helpful. And let me tell you, every room I walk into makes people uncomfortable because we're talking about change. And so
Right.
that's a little bit of like embodying that, maybe not leaning in and arm wrestling things to change, but kind of, as Pamela said, making the space for others to come along. And there are a few examples. First of all, I'm also not a big fan of what I call suggestion box innovation, where it's just a free for all of inputs. And so when it comes to these high pressure situations, that's usually those times where people are just ready to throw something at the ideas and the change. And so coming in thoughtfully, taking the time, less on the slides and more on the strategy to think, how will I gather that input? Who has the decision rights? And recently I did a LinkedIn series about words worth shedding in the business space. And one of them for me is buy-in, because buy-in is like an endless appeasement. And so it makes those high pressure communication moments disorienting and chaotic. And so it's really important to just focus on where does everyone's strategic input come in and to channel that in, especially in those high pressure moments.
Completely. Pamela, I'd also love your take here. What strategies do you use personally to stay clear and confident when the stakes might be high?
Oh, I think that's actually really having a really strong relationship with yourself. You're
Mm.
having talks way before you start this conversation, and you're talking about your motivation. As Ruth talked about, you can have everyone come in with a strong opinion or an agenda, or your confidence about what you're going to speak about. But there's got to be, the way that I think about it and I teach about it is that you want to think about there's another person over there, or maybe a group of people. Instead of you thinking about you and those other people, or you and that other person, think about the conversation as a shared space together. It's a space of honor, it's a space of respect. And when you do that and you come in with the right motivation that you want this conversation to have a positive or at least non-harmful impact on everyone, a lot of it has to do with your motivation before you go in, that you're settled, you're calm, and the worst thing you can do is feel like you've got to drive your agenda. It won't work. People will feel it. It will not be successful. You'll see people react because they can feel you trying to push your opinion on them. Have an opinion. State it when it's appropriate. But I like to state my opinion after 3 people have spoken. So number 1, be settled and grounded about your motivation before you go in. Number 2, make sure you've got a space. You're thinking about the conversation as an honored space between you and the other party. And number 3 is don't put forth your view first. Be patient. Listen to other people. They'll feel you honored them and they'll be more willing to listen to you.
Completely agree. Sean, if you're still with us, how do you approach high stakes conversations when you're balancing business realities like growth or costs or external pressures?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think just like what you guys have said and on with your guys' thoughts on it, I think just being thoughtful, being patient, and not jumping too soon into something that might, be the wrong thing to say or wrong thing to do. I think just patience, being thoughtful, being truthful, and that conviction, I think has been really important in dealing with those challenges.
Absolutely. And I'll add quickly my perspective from the agency side of things. We here at the Edit operate in a lot of high stakes client facing moments. And what I've learned from that, and a through line from what Pamela, Ruth, and Sean, you've all said, is that clarity always wins over explaining. The more pressure there is, what I've found is the more simple and direct you need to be. And second is energy. People really look to you to set the tone. If you're calm, if you're clear, it ends up diffusing a lot of tension immediately. I'm a big proponent of energy. All right, with that, I want to shift into influence because communication isn't just about clarity, it's also about moving people. Pamela, would love to start with you. In your experience, what makes messaging truly persuasive and action oriented?
For the team or for a client or for anything?
For either or both, up to
Okay.
you.
So I think, what you're really looking at is what is that need that you need to solve or the problem you need to solve. We call it a challenge. We don't use the word problem. So I'm very big on language. We always say challenge. We're going to resolve it. It's not a problem. What's the challenge you need to resolve with your team or with your client? We're really looking, you really shouldn't be coming at it from your viewpoint. You should be really looking, I want to solve this for my team. And so starting off, when you start off and there's an issue with your client, your team, really start by rephrasing that. If I understand correctly, I understand that this was a corporate client the other day, they wanted to reduce their costs. I want to make sure you understand, I understand that you want to reduce your costs. And then they said yes, and then they added on some other things. So you don't just assume you understand what the issue is. Usually it's the iceberg, right? What the client says, usually there's a bunch of things underneath there as well. What was interesting in this client situation is they wanted to reduce their costs, but they didn't want reduced quality. We had to show them the trade-off. We'll still provide a certain level of quality. This was providing vetting for a company. When we vet the nonprofits, that protects them. If something goes wrong with the nonprofit, we're responsible, not the company. We protect their PR, we protect their brand. But by asking us to lessen our costs, that meant instead of doing 24 stages on our quality model, we're doing 6. We can do that. But then there's a trade-off there. What ended up happening is we only had to reduce our cost by about 5% because they realized, no, we do want the protection. So if a client comes in and says, I want to reduce costs, you should be responsive to that and also show them this is what happens. You get less quality, less protection. We are not going to protect you from the IRS or from terrorism and these things. We're only doing these 6 stages. They may change their mind. It may change the situation. So make sure you understand the question and then show what the trade-offs are by getting, for example, that lower cost. In our case, we're very grateful. We only had to reduce the cost by about 8%. And so that to us was a big win rather than like a 60% cut. But I would say you don't really know what the issue is, what the client is saying. Once we realized that the issue was, oh my goodness, protection was really the most important issue, then that cost became secondary.
And follow-up question for you, Pamela, and I'd love to ask this question to Ruth and Ruth as well as Sean. For all of you, how do you adapt your communication style depending on who you're speaking to? And Pamela, you kind of touched on this, whether that's your team, a partner, public, leadership.
Yeah. So for example, I'll give you 2 examples that happened the other day. One
Right.
client, huge ego. Another team member, extremely nervous. We have a very strongly global team who is a new
Okay.
team member from the Philippines. So obviously you're taking a beat. Those are very different situations. On the one who's got high ego, they need to know they're in charge. You're not. So what you need to do is just barely speak at all and validate if it's ethical and it's correct and let them lead the room. That's what they want to do. In fact, I've closed companies before by listening 99% and just saying, I understand, you're right. And they're like, she's great. And then I closed the company. I actually didn't really go over the points of universal giving. But what I did was honored their communication style. I'm going to be ruling this meeting. You're not. And they must have made the decision prior, or they liked that we were such good listeners. So that's how I handled that with that client. You let them speak 99% of the time. And if they want you to speak, they'll let you know. You do not interrupt. On the team member who was nervous, I stopped my agenda and I just said, we're so glad to have you here. And you were chosen by a panel, and you made it through 6 months of interviewing. So I just want you to know you are loved and cherished here. So this is our first time meeting. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. You can tell me about you. And I dropped everything else. I dropped the orientation. I dropped everything else because I'm actually going to make more progress with them once they're comfortable speaking with me. So you can't get everything done in a meeting that you always think. Building that long-term relationship and listening to what's needed, adjust on that meeting. I ended up having someone else do the orientation. They were too nervous around me for the things I needed to orient them on. And so allow that person to relax. Very different. I needed to tell stories, be warm, be personable, share about my life. I made them laugh. I told them, which is true, that when I was 10, I had buck teeth and I couldn't close my mouth. They relaxed immediately when they thought of me that way. Very, very different stories, very different ways to handle it.
Thanks so much for that insight. And what a skill to be able to adapt from the ego client to the nervous team member. Ruth, same question for you.
Yeah, I think my answer is it's going to surprise everyone. But in this innovation role, you have too many audiences. You have an executive team, you have a board, you have your own team, you have teams across the organization. You're a highly visible person. That's just internally. Then you have the startup community, the innovation ecosystem, the media.